This is Bonjour Hi, the Settling for Biden edition. I'm Avi Feingold, and I'm here with Phoebe Maltz-Bovey and special guest Ben Wexler. We are your Frozen Chosen. On today's show, we have a spirited conversation about Jews as settlers. We talk about the safety of Jews in the diaspora, and, of course, the American presidential debate. All this and more coming right up. Phoebe, happy 4th of July.
Thank you. Thank you. You too, being...
Correct, but I am in Canada, so
okay.
I can...
So,
yeah, I have a neighbor who... he told me that they do a barbecue. They do a staged reading of the Declaration of Independence every year on their 4th of July barbecue. It's kind of people get into it in America. We have a special guest. We have a guest host today, Ben Wexler.
Hi.
Welcome to Bonjour Hi.
It's great to be here.
Hi, Ben.
Look, I know Ben for quite a while, at least 10 years or so. Ben, I feel like, emerged as a fully formed adult in so many ways, even when I knew him as a much younger than adult individual. Tell us what you're doing and these days. I know you're a writer. You just graduated from McGill, starting a PhD.
Yeah. So I was studying history at McGill, doing a lot of Jewish history, also some Middle Eastern history and more theoretical stuff around state building, nation building, minoritization. And I'm now going to be doing more of the same, hopefully, at Washington University of St. Louis. The recent kind of anti-Semitic violence in Montreal especially, but Canada generally, has made me more interested in writing for the public on this topic. So I have been doing some of that.
Ben, what I've noticed with your writing, you write about Albert Memmi, you write about France and colonization, all these topics that I happened to do my PhD in a while back. And you know about all these things that I only learned about well into grad school and all of this. How do you know so much? And how did you end up with those topics?
One of the reasons I like listening to this podcast, by the way, is because your background is similar to mine. And I did run into the thesis that you had written while doing research recently, actually. So that was fun. But to answer your question, I became interested in sort of the theoretical study of anti-Semitism, specifically when I was doing an exchange semester in Germany last summer. It was sort of emotionally affecting. It was intense, particularly to see the way that Jewish life there is securitized and really like under constant police protection, effectively. And there's been a general, renewed interest in specifically France, because there's been all this work on the intersection between sort of post-colonial and Jewish studies, even though I take a different view than a lot of scholars on that stuff. It also points in a similar direction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do think it's hard if you know about France and Algeria to just sort of, like when you see stuff about like, well, Israel's just exactly the same as Algeria. It's like, well, not really. Like there may be like some small differences there. But I wanted to talk just about specifically this question of, because your article in La Revue Ca is called The Eternal Settler, and you're talking about, and you cite the thing I was talking about for the Canadian Jewish News a while back, this idea of Jews as settlers anywhere we are, basically. Like Jews are called settlers in Israel, Jews are called settlers, everybody who's not indigenous is, of course, a settler in North America, the way people speak about this. And then in Europe also, right? Sort of this idea of an interloper, a settler. And I guess I just want to talk about this thing, this sort of like the go back to Europe requests that sometimes come up at protests lately. And I just want to go right to kind of like the sort of blunt thing of, is this basically just a go die request? Because I guess I feel like a lot of the times I was seeing this at first, I was thinking like, is this literally go to Poland? And then I'm thinking, well, what would happen if, no, it's like, but then I'm thinking like, is this either saying Europe as kind of a euphemism for World War II Europe, or is it just basically like anywhere Jews would live, it's a problem? And is it, because it seems like in your article, you're saying that it's a request that Jews be settlers everywhere we go, but is it, if a settler is evil, is it more than that?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. it certainly resonates often as a, go back to the camps kind of thing. It's very rarely do people say, we want you to die as a collective. It takes a lot to get there. It's much easier to say you should go back where you came from. Mm-hmm. And this is something I get at towards the end, where Jews become the European in Canada in this very weird way. Mm-hmm. And in some way, the representation of Canadian racism and the alienation of people of non-European backgrounds from the Canadian state. Mm-hmm. So it seems like this neutral thing where, we Canadian Muslims, right, in this scenario are saying, go back to Europe because that's what we've been told to do, right? We've been told to go back to Syria or go back to Gaza. But in fact, that ends up targeting Canadian Jews in a very specific way. Mm-hmm. And it has a different resonance for Canadian Jews than it would for another person of European background in Canada.
Right. I mean, I really want to get into that too, but I just, the whole go back to thing is just making me think also of the go back to Palestine that would be hurled at European Jews before,
right.
Like this in Herzl's era, but also just even more so connecting that with the whole movement that I've seen a bunch on Twitter where somebody will say, like, don't eat at this cafe. It's run by an Israeli. This person used to live in Israel and now lives in New York, Montreal, whatever. And it's like, but they moved away from Israel. Shouldn't that be the good thing? And then it's like, well, clearly there's something else going on.
So I'm deep in the research for this piece that I'm writing for the CJN, which won't be out for a while, but I've been thinking about this a lot. And I just spoke to somebody who's really involved in the, Jews as settler colonialist, but this person is Jewish and in that world, right, is very much an anti-Zionist. And he was making the distinction between, and this is something that he said is common in the anti-Zionist, the Jewish anti-Zionist world, he was making a distinction between the Jews who were always in the land and the Jews who were Western who came in. And he was basically saying, even in the Jewish anti-Zionist world, nobody claims that Jews don't have roots in the land. Those are indigenous Jews, but that doesn't mean that all Jews as a result have rights to come and settle, somewhere else. Is this an argument that you've heard elsewhere? Is this something that exists only within the Jewish world to try to justify their like, yes, we are settler colonialists? Because it was fascinating to me to hear that, but I couldn't wrap my head around how that works elsewhere.
Right. So this is something I've heard before. And I should specify, I think that there is some value potentially to the analysis of Israel as a settler colony. I think the work of like Arnon Degani, who I cite in the piece, is really representative in that sense, where if you think of settler colonialism as a particular method for building a distinct society on top of a previously existing society, you can, in fact, think of Israel as a settler colony, even if it might be a kind of peculiar one. But to that point about the distinction between indigenous Jews and Western Jews, there are a few problems here. One is that there really isn't a significant distinction between what the Zionists would call the old Yeshuv and the new Yeshuv, certainly not today. Even at the time when the state was developing, there was lots and lots of interaction between the old Yeshuv and the new Yeshuv. There were some communities which were ultra-Orthodox and opposed religiously to the Zionist project at the time. There was also lots of intermingling and assimilation. So the idea that there's some clear distinction there is a little fictitious, I think. It's also worth underscoring that about now, I think more than half of the Jewish population in Israel is not, in fact, Western in origin. They arrived to Israel through the Arab world. That doesn't necessarily make them not settlers. That's another question. But if we are making the distinction between indigenous Jews and Western Jews, that is false.
Bring it back to this whole thing about, I'm going to bring it back to North America a little bit, because I think in a weird way, even though all of this, it requires having all of this knowledge of the history of colonialism to kind of make sense of, a lot of this seems to come down to things being very convenient for existing North American conversations. So you write, in the article we're talking about, you write, by way of anti-Zionist critique, a student union of settlers can finally make authoritative decisions over unceded indigenous land. The good kind of multiculturalism, the good kind of settler, can be distinguished from the bad by its relationship to the Zionists. So I'm thinking about this, so end quote, and I'm thinking that this just like, so in 2020 and just after, there were all these racial reckonings in the US and beyond, along with a surge of, like a new surge of outrage about Canada's mistreatment of Indigenous children in residential schools. So it's, you know, all the era of like white people self-flagellating and saying you have to read Robin DiAngelo, you're canceled because you're the bad person, whatever, and you're a Karen, all of this. And so what I'm wondering is just to what extent this new North American anti-Semitism is less, like it's the pretext is what's actually happening in the Middle East and Gaza, and it's not that that isn't all terrible, and that is obviously, it's real stuff, it's in the news, people are aware of it, but that it's all, but maybe on some level, it's, the reason it's playing out as it is here is this domestic context, and I mean domestic in the US and in Canada, not claiming these are the same country as each other, but just where there are a lot of white non-Jews who are sick of feeling guilty and are really happy to, you know, like, isn't this convenient? You know, because there's terrible stuff happening abroad all the time. Gaza's terrible. Other things were terrible before that. Other things will be terrible after that. How much is that, basically?
Yeah, so you definitely get at something key to the piece, which is that I am arguing that this has to do with Canada. It's not just about Israel and Palestine, and it's. But
I'm wondering, is it more about Canada? I guess because it's definitely key in your piece. But I'm just wondering whether you see it as.
I think it is more about Canada than it is about Israel and Palestine. A caveat on, I think it is easy. It is convenient for us to talk about sort of white guilt in the context of anti-Zionism in Canada, much as it is easy for anti-Zionists to talk about Christian Zionism when they're talking about Zionism. So particularly in the Canadian context, I think we should be serious about the fact that a lot of the people who are most involved in this activism in Canada are Muslims and Arabs, Canadian Muslims and Arabs. So I think there is certainly an element of how white people engage with this that is distinct and of interest. Like you say, it comes after the racial reckoning of 2020. And I think not only a symbolic and organizational anxiety about how to justify political action today, because there are so many potential traps to political action on the left at the moment. And anti-Zionism offers sort of a way to self-indigenize.
If I can translate for the people without a PhD or not about to get one. No, it's okay. The sense that I'm getting, what both of you are saying, is that the reason why, and tell me if this is what is going on, the reason why what's being spoken about in this whole anti-Israel discussion is that the white people in Canada recognize that land acknowledgements and saying that we are unceded land is really problematic because, as I've said many times, if all of a sudden somebody showed up with a deed to the land and this person is talking about, you know, unceded land, then in theory that person would have to get up from their house and move because that's what they really, quote unquote, believe. And it's easy to just shift that to Israel where it's far away and we have a much more recent issue of deeds and land and who owns who and what than it is to talk about it here. Is that what you both seem to be saying?
Yeah, that's a good description.
So then to add to that layer, because you're talking about the idea of faith here, and the thing that has been crossing my mind about this is there seems to be a lot of parallels to people on the left, for example, fearing that America is becoming a Christian nation. And if that's the case, and that a lot of the things that are going wrong with America is that it's becoming a Christian nation in fact and not just in deed, and that Israel as a Jewish nation is going to be equally problematic and that's part of where the issues are.
Yeah, so that's it's an interesting comparison. Part of the problem there is that for the American right, that is absolutely the comparison that they are making and want to.
But they're happy with that, and that's why they're pro-Israel.
Right. And this is something I get at towards the end, is that if Judaism has this like highly charged symbolic role in Western thought, even today, and currently that goes a little both ways, where on the one hand there is a strain in the West that wants to transform Israel into the image of religious and ethno-nationalist statehood. And there are many people in Israel who are very happy to collaborate with and build that reality. Likewise, on the left, there are people who see Israel as representative of all of the dangers that can possibly arise in a society like America and Canada. In both cases, that becomes a way of thinking around the domestic context, the details of what is happening locally.
Mm-hmm. So this is really making me think of there's even like a third way, although I guess maybe it's closer to the right, although it's hard to say. There's
a third way.
Yeah. And I'm thinking about this, like, I don't know if have you ever read Ronald Schechter's Obstinate Hebrews?
Yeah. Okay. He's a big influence.
My favorite book I read in grad school. And
it's great.
And he's great. And yeah, it's a wonderful book. But it's really about this idea of like using Jews as an idea and how that, this has been like the most influential thing for me when I think about this. And little preview for future CJN magazine readers, this is going to be coming up in something I'm writing for that. But basically, this idea that just this sheer fact of thinking of Jews as an idea rather than as people is kind of the source of all these problems, right? And I'm thinking specifically, though, about what you're writing about, Ben, in terms of Jews representing state power, which you also bring up in your piece for the Canadian Jewish News. And just this sort of history and present of Jews representing liberalism, being centrist, being reasonable, being measured, all of this, and how you might say, oh, these are all lovely things to be. And some people will say yes, some people will say no, but whatever. But that's still a problem because, then if liberalism isn't popular, then Jews are really unpopular in all of this. And I'm thinking about this. This is going to be a little bit out there, but I bring this up a lot, where there was this piece in, I think, the Free Press, the Barry Weiss thing about that Jews are the new normies and like conflating frat boys and Jews, which just, to my mind, seems so... You would never have seen that even like 2 years ago. It's bizarre, the idea that frat boys would be like Jews. But anyway, but this seems to be really a big thing today, especially with the police are guarding a Jewish institution, whereas Jews' perceived enemies are like masked anarchist protesters in an encampment with like, the funny hair and whatever the counterculture is. Yeah. So I'm just wondering, like, is this new, this idea of like, because it is and it isn't, right? This idea of Jews as representing the sort of staid middle.
I don't know if I would think of frat boys as really the normies, actually. Like, it's a very particular subculture of America. But part of the idea, part of what I'm trying to bring attention to in this piece is that there is today an idea of Jews as having been associated with the left and the kind of revolutionary left. Certainly there were many Jews very involved with the left whose background as Jews informed that participation. But historically, Jewish communities, have been pretty conservative in the small c sense, in that their survival was attached to their alliance with, to an unequal alliance with the powers that be. As I mentioned there's this really interesting thing that happens where when the peasants or the city, the burghers or the nobles get unhappy with the king's reign, sometimes they will go and attack the Jewish quarter. or they'll accuse the king of being in league with the Jews. Oh, yes, there's a great phrase used by Noémie Issan Ben-Shimol, who has written for Kay in the past. She's a French Jewish. She talks about like vertical alliances. And a large part of Jewish history has been a history of vertical alliances. And certainly now that's what we're seeing develop. That is to say, an alliance between Jews and state power. That is a relationship of dependency.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I mean, it's so interesting just because when you do know more of this history and you know a little bit about like where Jews were in Algeria, and you know about things like the Crémieux Decree making, you know, Algeria's Jews, but not its Muslims, French citizens, and that this was in the 19th century. It's all of this discussion about the number of Jews who came from the, you know, Arab and Muslim world to Israel. They already pre-Israel had a sort of strange or range of different strange status there, and often more aligned with state power would be one way to put it. If you have an extremely 21st century US brain for it, you would say they were kind of the white people. And there was a racial element to how this was all playing out in terms of the racist ideologies of the day and all that. But yeah, anyway, Avi.
Again, to bring it back for the non-PhDs, you know, in the room, but just to reframe what's going on, and this is a question, I guess, for both of you. Then, how much of this entire, you know, discussion, and by discussion I mean everything about Jews and the term settler colonialism, post-colonial discussions, how much of that is just framing whatever's going on in the language of the time? And we have done this in the past with capitalism, Marxism, and the Jews. We will do this again in the future when there is another paradigm about how to view history in 10, 20, 100 years from now, and we will re-prosecute the whole thing again and again. So if that's the case, I guess I'm not saying that one shouldn't care about it, so to speak, but is this just like, great, so this is another lens to see what's going on, and it happens to be that whenever there's a lens, we tend to look at the Jews also in this way?
It's a good question you bring up, Avi. This is something I've been thinking
because if that's the case, it's like, great, in 10 years, this is going to be over. Nobody's going to care about post-colonial theory. We're going to have moved on from it. And so, fine, leave me alone. Let me go to shul on Shabbat and stop talking to me about this stuff.
It's an interesting question. How useful is the scapegoat, right, as a big picture explanatory theory? I actually had this debate in a class that I was taking because I refused to use the term scapegoat in a paper I was writing that involved stuff around anti-Semitism and the Jews. I think Phoebe mentioned Ronald Schechter earlier. He uses the phrase "good to think with." Jews are good to think with, and I think that maybe explains the reason why I am interested in analyzing this in its specificity rather than just saying, okay, Jews are a scapegoat for what's going on. Because there is actual intellectual work being done. We are looking at people analyzing their situation with reference to the Jews, and that is a productive process, even if it produces some things that are worrying or dangerous, potentially.
I'm writing, broadly speaking, about the people who like Jews at this moment in time, not the ones who hate Jews at this moment in time, but all the sort of somewhat fraught things that happen from the people who are the big philo-Semites of the day and what that's all about. So, that's why I think I agree very much that this isn't about, I mean, I think it's not that I wouldn't use the term scapegoating in some cases. I think this thing with the white guilt angle, which agreed would only apply to people like the ones in my Toronto neighborhood who are all in for Palestine and are very white. But I think, yeah, scapegoating there, sure. Is it scapegoating when somebody with no personal connection to or knowledge of the Jewish world is suddenly posting constant, sort of like a constant flow of was it like a fire hose type pro-Israel, pro-Jewish, anti-Semitic content? that's still using Jews as an idea. That's still because of where you sit in culture wars teams, making it all about Jews. And it's still damaging in its own way to actual Jews who either don't fit with what this idealized image, and that's a problem, then, and I forever am going to bring up the example of a roommate I had in college who had a very sheltered Christian white girl who had never met a Jew before and was extremely excited to live with a very scholarly, serious person who didn't have any fun and was just going to be doing her homework. And then like a few days into the college orientation, she was very disappointed, and we had to process this. But yeah, I mean, the thing is, like, Jews as an idea, it's never good, even if it's a positive idea, even if it's something, again, sort of anodyne, like be a nice liberal who doesn't shake things up.
Yeah, I think that part of this seeing Jews as an idea, I think we need to be more serious about analyzing these as connected ways of thinking about Jews, both the ones that are explicitly anti-Semitic and the ones that are supposedly philo-Semitic. With sort of Christian philo-Semitism, traditionally Jews have been pretty good at that, at taking that at a distance. With the stuff around Israel, a little less so, I think. There's a little more naivete in how they relate to that. But the important thing for me, and what I've been trying to do in a lot of the writing that I've done also for the CJN, is just to have us thinking about these alliances are not without consequence. The decisions that Jews make in relation to these highly charged symbolic ideas will have impacts on our community beyond the immediate, whatever it is.
Yeah, but at the end of the day, we basically, what Phoebe's sort of getting at is maybe it's time that we stop using us as a lens. Let's go away. Let the Jews do their thing for a while and stop using, this thing. And the fact that it's being used is the problem itself, and that's. I hesitate to say that it's anti-Semitism or philo-Semitism. It's weird that it's just weird. There's the attention that's being given to us. So I don't know what to make of this, except for the fact, the thing that I keep thinking back to is that question that I made before, that I said before, about how like we were, Zionism arose as a result of like asking these questions about nationalism, and nationalism was cool, right? And nations were cool. And so we decided, yes, let's do this. And we really didn't necessarily fit into that paradigm as a Jewish people, right? Nation is a little complicated when it's more of a faith-based something or other, but we sort of shoehorned ourselves in, and now this is the result of that. And I have been asking for this a while, that isn't it time that we really honestly reassess the fact that there's a lot more quote-unquote faith to the notion of an idea of a Jew, as opposed to the idea of a nationality and a people.
But Avi, isn't there just an asymmetry angle? Like, you can talk about what Jews should do, but at the end of the day, Jews do not have control. Sorry, anti-Semites. Jews do not have control over what the whole world does and how the whole world talks about us. So all we could do is tune it out.
And entertainment.
Right. But Avi's going to have his little joke. But like, I'm saying, yes. What I'm saying is, what you're talking about, Avi, is, if I understand you correctly, is this kind of Jews should just tune it all out, all of this, because it's going to be happening whether Jews are interested or not, isn't it, to some extent? And I guess this also goes back to Ben's point about like these alliances. I mean, how much does it matter who Jews choose? Because obviously Jews are making alliances all over the place. You get right-wing Jews making certain alliances, left-wing Jews making other alliances. But at the end of the day, there are just so few of us, and we don't actually have some sort of collective hold over the world, not least because we can't agree on anything.
And I would add to that, one of the ways that Jews do have a voice is by participating in these symbolic systems that place them as some kind of weird symbol. So, for Israel, for example, that wants, Western support to continue its war in Gaza, it's very useful to make some alliances that are both material but also symbolic with right-wing regimes around, Europe and potentially a Trump presidency in America. If you are a Canadian Jew like Ezra Levant, let's say, who thinks that really Muslim immigration is the one danger to Canadian Jews, then it makes sense for you to put yourself at the forefront as the spearhead, essentially, of this state effort a potential state effort to prevent more Muslims from immigrating to Canada. There are lots of Jews who are interested in participating in these symbolic systems. Also, Jews who are involved in anti-Zionist movements, who are, at the front of the crowd, at the front of the crowd outside of the Spanish and Portuguese, saying that Jews colonized South Africa and Germany.
I just wanted to kind of bring things full circle a little, which is just that there are constantly articles about how Jews have no future in, the latest one I've seen is something, Jews have no future in France. I've seen this for Canada, I've seen it for the US, I've seen it for Britain, and of course for Israel after October 7th. So I'm just thinking about, I keep thinking about these in terms of the anxiety it seems to produce, right? Like, I can't be living here. I've got to move, but to where? And there's never any sort of relative assessment of safety or happiness or whatever. It always seems to be like, it's terrible here. We've got to go where, who knows? But to me, this seems kind of like a Jewish, like from Jews, like a root, like Jews are producing it. But it's kind of a flip side to this Jews as settlers discourse that's coming from Jews. So we're talking about this whole thing of like the outside world using Jews as an idea, but this is Jews speaking about ourselves. But this whole thing, like, I wonder what you make of this sort of Jews have no future in genre that one sees so much of these days.
There's a joke. It's in one of those Albert Memmi books, but I really like it. What one Jew says to another, "I'm moving to South America." The other Jew says, "That's very far." The first Jew says, "Far from where?"
There. Yes.
It's a dry little joke, but it's about, that feeling of losing a referent. Another story to this point that I found very funny is I go to a Hillel over here in Montreal, or I went to the Hillel at McGill, and we would say, a blessing for our country. Which is something you'll say in some Canadian and American synagogues. And typically in Canadian and American synagogues, you will say a blessing for our country, Canada, let's say. At the Hillel at McGill, they never specify.
No.
Because a lot of them there are Americans.
Yeah, I was going to say there are probably a lot of Americans.
So, but both of those are, I guess, just funny stories about this feeling of lacking a referent. I think we should take seriously the fact that Jews in Canada are very, very safe relative to a lot of other places. That this remains one of the best, not only, one of the best places to live as a person in the history of the world, one of the best places to live as a Jew in the history of the world. At the same time, it's important to take seriously the deterioration of the conditions of Jewish life. And I don't know that there's like a snap solution for that. But I don't know that the like, you should all be moving is feasible.
No,
there are lots of
I'm
Jews,
very against the you should all be moving thing, because I think unless there's a real reason to think that there's an imminent danger in a specific place, people are, better to, make it work where you are and where you're happy than, there is, I guess what I'm saying is there is no perfect place. And once you remember what everything else is like, you might realize where you are is not so bad.
I just find it fascinating that if the people that repeatedly accuse Jews of being settler colonialists would hear the amount of discussion that happens internally about how we always feel like refugees and we're always running and we should be moving and we should always be on the move and we should all have multiple passports, it feels as if like that is the opposite of what it means to be a settler or a colonialist. And, you know, the fact that we see ourselves in that way, I think, is it genuine, or is it reflexively back to the idea that like, well, we're not settlers, we're always refugees? I'm unclear on, you know, what's the chicken and what's the egg there, but I do still find it fascinating.
I'll disagree with you there, Avi, about refugees and settlers being opposite things.
Yeah, didn't you read the article, Avi?
No, I did. I what I'm saying is that the notion that like we're always running, right, is there. And by the way, one of the interviews that I did, there was made an explicit point about that as an anti-Zionist. He was like, well, you know, I get that the reason why there is the world's largest refugee population now in the Palestinians is directly the result of the fact that the world chose not to settle refugees post-World War II, and those were the Jews.
Yeah.
And there's irony in there, and it's a little sad. And he's like, that doesn't make it right. But it is interesting to note, and it's on the world's hands, that you didn't do it in 1945. So now you're dealing with the Palestinians, and this is their way to fix it. But that's, again, we can be talking about that for another hours and hours and hours.
Yeah. And that's a point that Hannah Arendt actually made, basically contemporaneously. She said the same thing about the sort of, the creation of a new stateless population in 1948. So there are a few different responses that we can have to this feeling that maybe we don't belong here anymore, or maybe some people don't want us to belong here anymore. One example I can give is there's a very stridently Zionist student newspaper that has emerged in Montreal called The Blue and White. And there was video, they were at one of these pro-Israel kind of counter-protests at McGill. And this was one of the contexts in which people started chanting at the Jews there, settlers, settlers, go back home. Typically that's like settlers, settlers, go back home, Palestine is ours alone, something like that. But they basically cut the last part. They were just repeating that one thing. And they posted a video of that on their Instagram and captioned it something like, yes, Israel is our home. So that's one interesting response, is saying, actually, yes, we are. It's the nationalist response, right? We are settlers here. The only place we truly belong is in the land of Israel. I don't like that at all. I don't like the acceding to the idea that we don't belong here. We don't belong in France. We don't belong in Germany. The only place we really belong is in the context of this, very historical nation state that many, many Jews, I don't think, want to live in.
Well, what about the ones who are in Montreal talking about it, for example?
Right. I mean, it's a curious, it's curious to accept that way of being talked about. It's one product of nationalism that I don't like, is saying, oh, actually, yes, you're right. We're foreigners here. We'll always be foreigners because truly we belong to Israel.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but that's really the dominant, that's in so many circles. That's very much the dominant way of thinking about it, because it's the only way that makes you feel that you belong, right? That you're somewhere. It's the only, for a lot of Jews, it's the only way to be rooted, really. I'm not saying for everybody, but I've definitely met many Jews who have that vibe.
It's present in the faith as well, right? There's a faith basis for that, some of that as well. I do think that it's important for Jews to continue to assert their belonging to places like Canada and the United States, even when it's hard, even when it feels as if there are people rejecting that, or even targeting Jews specifically for their belonging, right? Belonging too much, having assimilated too much.
So you're about to move to America. Is that correct?
Yeah.
What did you watch the presidential debate?
I did.
And
it was bad. It was real bad. Yeah, it's funny. Like in some ways, I feel, I'm not fleeing Canada, but it does feel like a relief to get out of Montreal, just because there has been, my high school was shot at. It has been close to home, some of the anti-Semitic violence. And now I'm going to the States where it really is like coming onto a moment of political crisis.
Have you been to Missouri before?
Never.
Okay. I won't say anything.
It's a lot. I did not realize how red it is, actually, when I accepted my... I thought it was one of the 50-50 swing states. No.
Wait till you see the billboards.
That's what I was about to mention, the billboards. I had never felt so Jewish. I was Alvi Singer with Annie Hall's grandmother when I saw these Jesus billboards. So you were saying a relief to leave Montreal in certain respects, you're saying?
Absolutely. I grew up in the city. I feel a lot less comfortable here than I did a year or two ago. The recent stuff has really shaken my feeling of belonging in this city. I hope that I can regain some of that with time and perspective. We'll see.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But so on a more general note, what do you think Biden's going to do? Do you think he's going to stay in the race?
I don't know. I think he should drop out.
I assume that's because you're all in for Trump, right?
I think Harris is the better candidate at this point.
I think David Frum made a very compelling argument in The Atlantic this week about how, as disastrous as Biden might be right now, any other option to make that switch this late in the game would be even more disastrous. And he's like, well, you guys stick it out. He made a pretty compelling case. He goes, upending this so late in the game would not shake a lot of faith, which would not do much to change things up for a lot of people. And the people that are voting, Democratic are not necessarily saying, I have so much faith in Biden. It's that I have so little faith in the other side to do anything right. And so it wouldn't really matter. And this might only shake things up and take the very few. I think there's only 17 swing voters left in all of the United States of America. I really do believe that there's a myth of the swing voter anymore. But I think that there's not that much that somebody can do to make a big shift thing in that way.
The problem is, Biden currently looks like he's going to lose, right? That is the problem here. So, you have a Republican Party that is I think very, very clearly a threat to American democracy at this point. I think a Trump victory would really be an existential threat. You have a guy who is losing and who has no real energy to... I can see no direction by which Biden gets things better. I can see lots of ways where he gets things worse. If he has an even worse gaffe on stage, if he dies,
mid-debate, for example, as I feared would happen.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Whereas I think a young candidate, if Harris gets on stage with Trump, and Trump does not look good in debates. He looks old and mean and incompetent. I think Harris could come across pretty well and actually give a boost.
So here's where I'm going to bring a Jewish analogy and attempt to save this, right? That I don't doubt Biden's ability to lead a country, period. I think that, yes, I seriously doubt his ability to be a very public figure. And this shook, my perceptions in a big way and added to that feeling. But if you look at the Haredi community, there's been a crisis of leadership there for decades already, right? There is no relatively young, charismatic rabbis who they look to because they look to rabbis. They are increasingly looking at rabbis that were all old pre-Yishuv, like the old Yishuv, right? There are fewer and fewer of those. There are none of those basically left, but they were doing this for decades. That was their connection back to say that this is historical. These are pre-war rabbis. They're the ones that are the giants. They were never public figures. They were always people in their 80s, 90s, and into their hundreds.
So what does this have to do with the U.S. presidency, Avi?
Because they realized that leadership is this intellectual thing that sits in a corner and leads and makes decisions and doesn't need to go and be this public face of TikTok for the country.
I don't know what's a TikTok. I'm 40 years old, right? But I'm a child compared to Joe Biden. You understand what I'm saying? And Donald Trump came across as young compared to Joe Biden, and he's 78 years old. I'm saying, put my cards on the table. I do not want Trump elected. I don't know whether it's existential for American democracy so much as that he'd be a crappy Republican president, and I don't even want a good Republican president, but I really don't want a crappy Republican president for Supreme Court related reasons largely. But I don't think it has to be Harris. I think there are other possibilities. I think if the enthusiasm for Harris is too low, then it could still be somebody else. I think this is the moment to figure out who that somebody else would be, if it is going to be somebody else. And I think that I'm fine with it being Harris too. But the whole, like the New York Times is like, no, not Biden. Go away, Biden. Matthew Iglesias does not want it to be Biden.
Well, we should all listen to Matthew Iglesias then.
Well, I'm not saying that we should all. No, I'm going to, if my next
please.
sentence was going to be explaining, he's somebody who's very like sort of measured in all of this, whatever. And yeah, I mean, like if the sort of normie, not really normie, because these are people more up on things than normie would imply, but if the sort of center left calm view of things is go away, Biden, you're not going to be able to be president, you're not going to be able to win or govern, then maybe this is the moment to figure out who would. And maybe, who knows, it could be somebody who Democrats are really excited about. And then there's all
that's
sort
the
of
problem.
elements. And then, I'm sorry,
there.
but with all due respect to a former guest on this program, I don't know that I would look to David Frum specifically for the person who cares the most about the left side of things doing well in America. I'm not saying he's any fan of Trump's, but I'm saying, is he the person? Like what I'm getting at is that there are people who are saying that Biden, everybody weighing in on this has their own agenda, right? And like, I'm not sure what he wants.
I hear. I just don't think that there's anybody compelling that's waiting to jump in.
But do you feel knowledgeable? Are you knowledgeable enough about who's out there?
There's public figures. This cannot be a Trevor Noah, right, coming out of nowhere to replace Jon Stewart and then saying this was great and we made it work. But this has to be somebody who is a known figure, and there isn't anybody. My suspicion, this is my overly simplistic, probably not true, but the narrative that I think was going to happen was it was a Biden-Harris ticket. Biden was like, look, I know I'm getting old. It's going to be a one-term thing. You're going to take over after 4 years, and it's going to be fine. But within a short amount of time, they realized she was not presidential material. And therefore, he was like, well, I have to do this again because there is nobody else right now. If there was an Obama-like figure, I've heard people say, oh, maybe Michelle Obama should take over, right, should do this. And that'll be, the atonement for Hillary Clinton, that maybe that would be something else. But I don't see there being anybody that is charismatic enough that is able to step in and make this a reality.
Was Joe Biden charismatic enough there on the stage?
I think 4 years ago he was, and that's the problem.
But I mean now. I like Joe
I'm
Biden.
With you. I'm with you.
He got America same-sex marriage. Good, well done, Joe Biden. The Joe Biden of today, I don't know. Seems like a different state of affairs.
Ben, you've been waiting to opine on this.
Yeah, I'm not worried about him as a, whether it's him making the decisions or not, I don't really care. I just think you don't need great. I don't think you need like a star on stage. I think Trump is actually a very easy candidate to beat. He's a very bad candidate at this point. Lots and lots of baggage. He looks old on stage, like I said.
Next to anybody who isn't Biden. Yeah.
Yeah, if it were not for Biden, he would look very old and embarrassing on stage. The question of like, could it be someone other than Harris? I think there's just an infrastructure problem. There is infrastructure for making the VP the candidate. It's a lot harder to do that with anyone else. And you suddenly open up the field. There's sort of a very realpolitik logic to making Harris the candidate, where if you were to suggest anyone else, suddenly you open up the fields to everyone. And then there can be a nasty internal competition that potentially peels away voters.
You know who would make an excellent candidate against Trump, and that would be Nikki Haley. I'd like to see a reverse Greta Van Susteren, thing happen and have her change her political affiliation, and I think she would give Trump a huge run for his money.
Nikki Haley?
Absolutely. she's her positions are changeable enough.
You mean to run as a Democrat?
Yeah, absolutely. As I said, change the ticket.
Well, if you guessed this and this turns out to be what happens, we can do a fun, you heard it here first.
Oh my God, yes.
I don't see this happening, but...
I don't either.
Sure.
Let's move on to our nachas right after we hear from our sponsor.
I can't date women right now because I'm too busy calling myself a piece of shit.
I had a dysfunctional Jewish mother and I had a dysfunctional Native mother.
I had 25 full years of utter struggle and failure.
I started to realize the absurdity of my inability to let go of this monster of guilt.
Sounds like fun, doesn't it? Hi, I'm Ralph Benrig. I'm the host of Not That Kind of Rabbi, where we look at people's spiritual journeys and take a little time for their self-reflection, and maybe yours. You can get it all at thecjn.ca/NTKR, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Ben, you have a nachas for us?
I'll return briefly to the article I wrote, The Eternal Settler. The feedback I've gotten has been really encouraging and positive. I've had a lot of people really, really across the political spectrum, from people to my left on questions of even Israel and anti-Semitism, to people on my right who have said that they found it really helpful and elucidating and useful. Also some interesting pushback and kind of subtleties, and it's been a really great, encouraging response.
Excellent. That's really great to hear, and that is good nachas. Phoebe,
It is.
do you have nachas this week for us?
I've struggled this week because the fact of the matter is I have little kids. I am not in my spare time taking in cultural or intellectual things beyond that which is most pressing for my work. I'm going to do a nachas. I'm going to do something I'm proud of too. You know what? I'm going to be proud. I sent in another chapter of my book to the editor, and I'm proud.
I'm clapping for you silently.
Because it's due. I'm writing a
good.
book that's due in August, which people keep telling me is next month, and this I refuse to accept. But apparently that has to be then done. So I'm proud, and I will, for the purposes of Bonjour High, call it nachas, even though I feel a little silly saying this because does not come naturally. I'm nachased to the gills that I got another chapter done, but I still have 2 more to turn in, and I'm broigust about that.
Fair enough. Another Phoebe nachas broigus 1-2 punch.
Yeah, what have you got, Avi?
I would like to call it. I found this website a little while ago as part of research for some other piece that I was doing, and I noticed that they just did an interview with Dr. Sarah Glass, who we just had on recently. But shtetl.org, SHTETL.org, has been doing really good work as a publication. They call themselves the Haredi Free Press. They say that they serve the free press for the Haredi community.
Not in the Barry Weiss sense of free press, in the more general sense.
In the sense that the majority of the Haredi press is not free in what they're able to publish and talk about and the stories that they run. And this is an organization run by an ex-Haredi and some other individual journalists who are basically reporting on the stories that are important to the Haredi community that the Haredi community doesn't want to talk about because it's it's too touchy because it might be shameful to them, it might be embarrassing internally, and it might lead to internal problems and show that the world is not as monolithic or as cohesive as one might think it is. So if you really want to lens into a community that you hear a lot about, but you don't think of as just like anybody else having their issues and having their problems, I would say check out shtetl.org.
Can I ask you about it for a second, Avi?
Sure.
You told me about this right before we recorded, and I was like, I've never heard of this thing. And at first I thought that this was like sort of a for us, by us Hasidic publication. This does not appear to be
I would say that the sense that I get is...
Who is producing
it? It's by formerly us, for the people that are either formerly within the community and want to still know what's going on, but also just as much for the people that are within the community and are not getting the news that they need. You know, like there's a story about a city councillor that is withholding a get from his wife, which we heard about when we had Flatbush Girl on. And, you know, that story isn't being reported on in the Haredi press, and it's too small of a story for the non-Haredi press to talk about. So the only way that the Haredi community might hear about it is from organizations like shtetl.org. You know, there's a story that came up recently about a Lakewood mother that killed her kids for whatever reason. There's a mental issue and stuff. This isn't a story that's being reported because it's not a feel-good story. And the only not feel-good stories that the Haredi community writes about is about non-Haredim and how bad they are. So this is an antidote to that. And really, I think it's an important part of
I guess what I'm wondering is, are
free press.
Very Orthodox Jews able to publicly be seen reading this? Not only does it have...
Yeah, but I was going to say, contrary to what people might think, not everybody who is Hasidic has a filtered internet connection that only has a white list of what's allowed and what isn't. There are plenty of people with smartphones. There are plenty of people with two smartphones, one that is filtered to show to the world and one that they check just at night, you know, and read whatever they need to be reading.
In that case, the noble, sensible part of me says, and what a wonderful thing. The other is like, if you have a separate phone for all your secret stuff, and what you do is you read the slightly secular news about your own community, when there are all the other things you could be doing with that phone. No, just it was a joke.
I'm sure they're doing those things as well.
It was just a joke. Okay, yes. Okay. Anyway.
Excellent. Ben, it's been wonderful to have you on. Thank you so much for coming on. Please come back anytime.
Yes, thank you so much.
It's great to come on. I've appreciated this podcast. I know some people who I put onto it. So you guys are
amazing,
very fun.
And I'm going to undo my nachas. My nachas is now that. Okay.
Thank you for listening to Bonjour Chai for the week ending July 6th, Shabbat Parashat Korach. The show is produced by Michael Freeman and edited by Zach Kaufman. The executive producer for CJN Podcast is Michael Freeman. Our music is by So-Called. We are a project of the Jewish Living Lab and are distributed by the CJN Podcast Network. You can listen to all our past episodes on our page at thecjn.ca/bonjour, and you can subscribe to the podcast and automatically receive all episodes on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. We would love it if you told a friend about Bonjour Chai. It is one of the best ways we get new listeners. And as always, you can email us with comments at bonjour@thecjn.ca.
Y'all remember that joke from Airplane? The old lady asked for some light reading.
How about this leaflet, famous Jewish sports legends?
But in actuality, that's changing. Jews are crushing it in sports around the world, and we are here to celebrate them.
Sandy Koufax gets his 10th strikeout.
Zach Hyman, his first career hat trick. 41 points for Diddy Avdia. It's Sue Bird's building.
I'm Gabe.
And I'm Jamie.
We love Jews and we love sports, but most of all, we love kvelling over Jews in sports.
Together we host Menschwarmers, the longest running Jewish sports podcast in the world. Listen and subscribe at thecjn.ca and wherever you find your podcasts.